Today I have the pleasure of speaking with Noelle Oak. Noelle has a long connection over many decades and many roles within the school. Noelle has been a parent, a board member, a development officer and our honorary archivist. Welcome Noelle, and thank you for joining us. Noelle, you have the privilege of being the author of our history book, Faith and Learning, the history of Scots School Albury from 1866 to 1991. My first question is, what got you involved in the school in the very first place, Noelle?
We came up from Melbourne, my husband, 3 children and I, in 1975. And my eldest child, a boy, was in year 4 at school. So when we went looking for school for him, or for all of them actually, he'd had a really difficult year the year before. And so we thought going to somewhere like Scots, if anything occurred again, we'd pick it up very quickly and be able to deal with it quickly. So he enrolled in year 4 at Scots. And of course at that stage, the junior school was up in the old Woodstock school in Lavington. The 2 girls went to the government school, but they eventually both of them came here in years 7 when they moved up into the secondary school. So from 1975 onwards, that's when it started. We were parents.
Great. So you started here with your 3 children. You had Warwick, Alexandra and Bronwyn.
That's right.
Could you describe the school when you first started here in the 70s and 80s?
I have to be very honest, the school was struggling. The numbers were down. We didn't know that at the time, of course, but it soon became apparent that the school was struggling financially, actually, and there was a lot of worry because the numbers under that current headmaster, the numbers had dropped. So they saw us as a very interesting addition to the numbers of the school, so we were glad we could do that. But that lasted until 1978, when the present headmaster decided to retire, and Alistair Todd arrived in the school from Sydney. Now, Alistair was a very experienced headmaster, and he had a different attitude and outlook completely. Alan Jones was good, but Todd was better. And as soon as Todd came, he could see what the school needed, because at that stage they tried to pull the boys and the girls together and they didn't really mesh properly. There was still a lot of antagonism, particularly from the boys and from the old collegians in the boys. How dare girls come into the school? Because, you know, from 1926, this had been a male dominion. So to have girls here was a bit sort of not okay. So the first few years were very rocky for that reason. I mean, a lot of the kids got on okay, but there was that slight resistance and it leached over into the ex-student body as well, which wasn't very complimentary. So when Alan Jones left and Alistair came in, he could see that there was a big problem. So his main aim was to get the girls up to the same level as the boys so that it was co-educational. And that was his major aim, but also to meld the parents so that we all became part of the school community. So from the beginning, it was a really hard row to hoe.
You went from being a parent to being on the school board.
Yes.
What was the motivation to do that, and what sorts of things did you do at that time on the board?
Oh, that's a very difficult question, actually. I think I was invited to join the school board, actually. I'd left the school, and so when the invitation came, I accepted it quite readily. It was the year we were building the chapel hall, so there was a lot of activity going on in the school. So I gladly accepted the invitation. But I was only on the school board for a couple of years because the position of the Director of Development came up, which I was very, very interested in. And I applied, not thinking that they'd consider me because I had been part of the school community. Much to my surprise, I got the job.
Great. And in that role as Director of Development, what were the main things that you worked on in those early days?
My major aim was to bring back the girls. At that stage, it was still very strongly male ex-student body. And the girls were there, but only the brave ones. And I just felt that the girls' school had had a rough deal because they'd been pulled out of their school, they'd lost a lot of their history, and so there was quite a division. They had their own reunions, but they didn't come into the school. This was still an alien land for them. So that was my major aim. So we started out, and I worked with their ex-student body, and we had a big reunion for the girls. And from then we gradually pulled them in. Everything that we had, any event or special event that we had, we made sure that the girls were brought into it and part of the planning process. So a lot of them, you know, had been around the school for a long time. They'd been ex-students in the 1920s, and so that was the 1970s. So I mean, they were still getting, some of them were quite elderly and very resistant and still angry, actually, about what had happened, and I didn't blame them for that. But gradually, we sort of wove them in to the ex-student body, and they came over into the administration of the ex-student body as well. Some of them were very, very vigorous, which was lovely. So I still think there's work to be done there, but probably because now time is going on, and any girl who was at Woodstock now would be fairly elderly, getting into their 70s. So it's the younger ones that have come in as Scots students from the 1970s now, and I think the ex-student body needs to be more visible. And I think it's up to the girls that came into the school in the 1970s and 80s now to pick that up and run with it.
Noelle, you then retired, but then decided to take on the role of honorary archivist.
Yes.
What was the motivation there? What was the interest in being honorary archivist?
Well, the headmaster at the time, when I said I was going to retire, I stayed for the first year because it was the transition between Alistair Todd and he. And so I got to know him for 12 months. And then when I left, he said, you know, he didn't want to lose all that knowledge. So would I like to come back and set up the archive? Now, there were two members of staff, the librarian and the lady who'd run the girls' boarding house, had done some preliminary work, some really interesting preliminary work, digging out old material from somewhere or other, and had started off a very minor collection in the back room of the library. So we took over one of the back rooms, the little offices at the back of the library, and we then purposed the undercroft of the library lecture theatre, and we put in shelving and all that sort of thing. And I was very lucky to get a fellow come to join me who'd been a grammarian, Dudley Scott, who was very, very knowledgeable because he'd been a school captain and he'd been to the school right from when he was a boy, a young boy. So, and he was very keen to come in and help. So that's where we started off, myself and Dudley Scott, with the archive and setting it up underneath the library.
So you also wrote a remarkable book about the history of the school. And can I tell you, I use that as my daily Bible. I go to that looking up everything all the time, Noelle. It's been such a great source of information for someone coming in. Rarely a day goes past that I don't look up something, either the history of a building or when something was built. So it's, for me, been a godsend. Are there some really interesting stories?
Where do we start?
Yeah, tell us about some of the really interesting stories that you sort of came across either through your time as the archivist or while you were putting this book together.
Okay. Well, I think one of the people who didn't get acknowledged was one of the early headmasters. His name was Joseph Masters. And when the Anglican school began here, he eventually came down because he was a congregational church minister. And he gone from Melbourne to Tasmania and eventually arrived in Sydney, and he was head of a training college up there, which collapsed. And so he had to look around for another living. And at that stage, the Congregational Church needed a minister. So they accepted him, and he came down with his wife and I think one child to Albury as the Congregational Church minister. But he was a very, very well-educated man, couldn't help himself, I think, and he used to give lectures, not in church, but separately to the community. And so the Anglican Church saw him as a very viable candidate and invited him to be the headmaster of the school, which he did. Now, he was with them teaching at the secondary level, and you've got to understand that it was a very small school until, as has happened often, the government withdrew funding from schools of that sort, and they just couldn't afford to have him on as a secondary teacher. They reverted back to the primary school. So, nothing daunted, he then, who lived just across the road from the actual school, he set himself up in Young Street in his own home and offered tuition, first of girls in the morning, boys in the afternoon, and started off his own secondary school. So eventually it grew, and then the climate here was very bad for him, and he just, in the end, had to give it up, and he and his family shifted to Tasmania. He went there as inspector of schools, and that's when Smith and his Wilson bought it from him. But unfortunately, Masters has never been acknowledged to what he did in actually being the basis of the school. So
the founding girls' schools, Noel, have a really interesting history.
The girls?
The girls' schools.
Well, there's been several of them actually.
Yeah, could you tell us a little bit about what you found out about those? Because I've read about Glen Eyre, Springfield, Rose Hill, Woodstock, lots of different founding schools there in different ways. Is there anything interesting from that sort of side?
Well, as usual, girls weren't seen to be needed to be educated. And so most of the schools that girls went to were either dame schools that women held in their own homes, and they learnt things like embroidery and geography perhaps, or a language, but it wasn't very academic until Jessie, I'm just trying to think of her second name, came along and set up her school, which was a little bit more academically oriented.
Was that Jessie Heath?
Yes, thank you. You have read the book. Yes, so she set up Springfield. But there had been another school called Glen Eyre down in the town. But the lady who had set up Glen Eyre eventually moved on and left her daughters running the school, but it was still very much a minor event. But Jessie was much more ambitious. So she bought Glen Eyre and set up her school, which lasted for quite a while, but then Jessie got ill and the school closed. So there was really no secondary girls' school here for quite some years until 1926 when Rose Hill opened. So this lady came down from Sydney to set up Rose Hill. And so that was the starting of Woodstock actually. So it was there until she sold the school through ill health. Yes, so when the Springfield closed, there was a hiatus and there was no secondary girls' school here at all. The Presbyterian Church had sort of ventured down into Albury looking at whether or not they should start a school here, but nothing ever came of it. So then Lillian Windridge arrived on the scene and she set up a school called Rose Hill, which was in a building right opposite the current school on the other side of Young Street, which did quite well. And it grew so much that in the end she had to move the school around into Kiewa Street, into another big building and land there. Again, the school just grew and grew and grew until they were seriously, everything was stretched to the limit. The council was a bit worried about the sanitary arrangements there. And so she was threatened of closure, actually. And then Anna Drennan bought the school from Lillian, who sold it because she had a family illness problem and had to go to South Australia. So when she arrived, she decided that she had to get the school out of where it was. So she bought the property, Woodstock, up in East Albury, which had been a family property for many, many years. And the school moved in there in 1928, I think it was. So, and that's where it just was there until it eventually was moved up into North Albury. So there had been a girls' school, except for that hiatus between when Jessie Heath left the school and when Lillian Windridge came in 1926.
There's some interesting anecdotes in your history book about students sleeping on verandas and all sorts of different sorts of things, showering outside, reading all sorts of things. Well, there's some interesting stories there, because I think we live in a world now where we're full of luxuries, but in these early days, boarding school didn't sound so fantastic.
No, it wasn't. Well, it was, especially for boys. That's, the school maketh the man. So there's no such thing as warm showers. We had cold showers in the morning. Often we'd probably share the shower with another boy just to get us through faster. And there's just recently been a commemoration of the Ivor story. And I can remember talking to one of the boys who was at the school at that time, having been woken in the morning by the headmaster. And of course, the Ivor had come down during the night at the racecourse, where everybody had lined their cars up either side of the racecourse with the lights on. Can you imagine? T-model Fords, so that the Ivor could land. And so the boys ran from school out to the racecourse the next morning to see the Ivor and see them digging it out. So, boys, every morning at the grammar school, the boys were woken, I think, at 6. No breakfast at that stage. Then they had to run the block or whatever was the designated route that morning, and it was changed so they couldn't skip off and miss parts of it. And there were prefects stationed at each of the areas where they could have diverted, so that they stayed on the course. So and then they'd come back to the school, have their cold showers, and then go and have breakfast.
Is it true also, Noelle, that we had our own railway station and siding here at Scotland?
Yeah, but that didn't come until the 1950s. There was a little train that came down from, I'm not quite sure how far, I don't think it went as far as Wagga, but it came down to Albury, and it brought things like milk and all that sort of thing, because there was a big cheese factory in Albury at the time. So whether it was started up because of the commercial situation, but of course that was just ideal for the boys who lived up at Henty and Holbrook and places like that. They'd come down on the train in the morning. Instead of having to walk all the way down to the station to get the train, they could get on it here at their own siding, which lasted well into the early 1970s, I think, actually.
Well, there'd be very few schools that had their own railway station.
Oh, yes. Yes. Well, the girls, of course, used it too.
Yes.
Even the girls at Woodstock. And then, of course, when the girls came here, it was the two sexes, yeah.
Now, well, there seemed to be a great connection with the school, with the 2nd 23rd Battalion here in Albury, and I was also reading through your book about the Army camping here, using it as almost an enlistment base and training base. Can you tell us a little bit about that? Because that also is pretty fascinating.
Yes, well, when the war started, of course, there was huge recruitment went on, and they had a training battalion at what was the Albury Showground, which of course is the school's main oval now. So they decided then that they would make it a full battalion. So eventually they recruited enough fellows who came in, and that was their training basis. The interesting thing was the school cadet unit, of course, was in the grammar school. And we didn't have Gillespie Oval then, that was the showgrounds. So between the oval and the school was this very high corrugated iron fence, which the boys got very adept during the show season of climbing over, which they weren't supposed to. But of course, when the soldiers came in, you could imagine the cadet battalion, who was very active here in the school, were very, very interested. And at the beginning of the war, they didn't have enough money to buy everybody the right rifles. So the cadet battalion loaned their rifles to the new recruits, so they were doing the initial training. So there was a strong bond then developed between the new battalion and the school's cadet unit. And that's why we've got that special memorial in the front entrance hall. There was a special plaque developed by the CEO of the battalion that was awarded when they went overseas, and they were in Tobruk and places like that, that was given. It was sort of an incentive for them to behave properly and to keep the camp tidy, and it was awarded to the best whatever in that particular week. So when they came back, the battalion brought it back here and gave it to the cadet unit, and that's why we have it. The Army would love it, but we haven't handed it over, and I hope the school never ever does, actually.
That's a fascinating story. You seem to have a great love of history.
Yes.
Have you always had a love of history? What inspired that?
I was sort of an
I'm a
English...
history teacher, Noelle.
Yeah. Oh,
so.
are you? Well, I was an English buff at school, and I could always write anything, you know. And I thought that was my destiny, actually. And I didn't go to university. I left school when I was 14 and went into the workforce. So when I married, my husband was a graduate, and he encouraged me, actually, and La Trobe in 1973, or in 1972 actually, opened its doors to what they call early leavers, and I applied, and I didn't get in that year, which was just as well because I had to have my gallbladder out, but the next year I reapplied and I got in, and I took English. Well, I don't know, I must have made a terrible mess of it, because my English tutor said to me, you know, I think you'd be better doing history, which was sort of like a backhanded compliment. But I embraced it, I loved it. And so that sort of started me off, actually, doing my history degree. And of course I got the job here at Scots, and by virtue of it being the sort of job I had, I ran the reunions, and I just got fascinated by them telling me of what the school was like back in the day. So that's what started my interest in sort of gathering information about what the schools were when they started.
Well, we're so glad that you went in that direction, because Scots has benefited enormously from your knowledge and understanding. There are very few schools I've been in, Noelle, that are 160 years old, let alone with the history captured like you have.
Well, in New South Wales, we're the oldest residential country boarding school ever. So that's, you know, quite an accolade, really. So we do have a reputation to maintain.
Yes. Noelle, can you tell us a little bit about 1975, when it looked like the pipe band was about to be disbanded, and was it apparently saved by a group of girls joining the pipe band?
Up to a point. I can't give the girls all the credit. Of course, the cadet unit had been very prestigious. It had won a lot of awards in competitions. It was a very well organised cadet unit, and part of the cadet unit was a fellow who'd been the school captain called Tony Brandt, who was also a piper. But when the school merged, I think the unsettledness of the time, and of course there might have been the attraction of the girls in the school for the boys, and they weren't quite so enthusiastic about being part of the pipe band. They couldn't help being in the cadets. That was just naturally, all the boys were in the cadet unit, but the pipe band was optional. So it started to lose momentum. Tony Brandt tried very hard to sort of keep it going, and then fortunately for the school also, a fellow came in as a teacher who was a science teacher called Doug Evans, who'd also been a senior boy at the school, at the grammar school, but he was also the pipe major. So he started to encourage anybody who was interested to have a look at the pipes. So with the girls there, of course, the boys were a bit, you know, girls, not too sure about that, you know, but they persisted. So When Alistair arrived in 1978, he sort of fixed it. He said, anybody who learnt the pipes could miss out doing the activity program on a Tuesday afternoon. So, all of a sudden there were recruits. And not long after that, a fellow called Kent Hilton came on board as a pipe tutor. And it was through Doug, actually, who got them back into a sort of a very jerry-built uniform. They sort of scrounged what they could, kilts and things like that from the cadet unit and the pipes, etc., to build up a substantial number. And the first time they sort of went out on their own was at the next Anzac Day march, where they marched from, I think, 2 blocks and then peeled off, because that was about as much as they could manage at the time. But of course it went from strength to strength. And I've got a special interest in the pipe band because one of my daughters was part of the pipe band. She was a piper.
Great.
Yes.
Noelle, you've studied all the different periods of the history of both Albury Grammar and the Founding Girls' Schools. Lots of different personalities in that history. Are there any key ones that you think from both either the headmaster perspective or the headmistress perspective who were crucial in ensuring that the school continued so that it is still alive 160 years later?
Look, I think the person who has to have the most credit, well, I have to say, when Jones was here, it was a tough job. And I think he did a good job, but I don't think he was the right person. And until Alistair came in 78, and Alistair was cometh the day, cometh the man. Alistair really picked it up and ran with it. He was really sort of the person who kick-started the whole thing. I mean, there were other people who were just as important in many ways. I think Alex Sellers retired at the right time, but he'd been here 30 years. I mean, that was a long time. We've had some outstanding people who've gone through the school as academics and teachers and administrators. It's a bit hard to sort of pick them out, both in the boys' school and the girls' school.
Mm-hmm. Any key headmistresses who you felt were pivotal at a really important time for the
I
school?
think probably Marrows, who came into the girls' school towards the very end. She was probably the most well-qualified academic. Not everybody liked her sense of administration, but she really, academically the school was very good. So she probably was the most significant person as far as the girls were concerned academically. But all of the headmistresses of the girls' school, there was a special atmosphere in the girls' school. It was very homely. And you talk to any of the ex-students, they just loved it. So I think, you can't pick one out that did better than the others. I think we have to acknowledge Jessie Heath. If it hadn't have been Jessie Heath, we wouldn't have had a secondary girls' school. And with the men, well, I mean, Sellers was here for so long. He came in after Smith, after Wilson, and was here until Tony Ray came in very briefly. He would have been an extremely good headmaster himself, but only stayed a very short time, went back up to Sydney to an all-boys school. I think that was Tony's betoir, the girls. And he left, and of course then Alistair came in. But Tony was a very good headmaster as well, yes.
Through those different periods of history, are there any themes that have been common right throughout the different times for both the boys' school and the girls' schools?
In what way?
So one I've read about is that the school often seemed to be struggling financially, and then someone would come in and really lift the school, and then it'd get through that cycle, and then there'd be more financial challenges. It just seemed to be a common theme through the history of the board.
Well, if you go back to the very early days, the school struggled. It was during the Depression when it went out on its own. So, it was a very viable school, and then the Depression hit. And that really tested them. And of course, the administration of the school changed around about that time. So again, numbers dropped appallingly, actually. So it wasn't until Sellers came in, who'd come from a very successful school up in Queensland, who really kick-started the grammar school and actually got in his little green Austin, I think he had, which the boys delighted in putting on the steps of the boarding house so he couldn't get down. And he'd get in his Austin and go out into the region. He did what everybody should do. He went out and sold the school. So he was very, very active in making the school knowledgeable to people who were farmers and graziers and things like that, because the school really was a rural boarding school at that time.
One of the grandparents shared a great story with me. It was a grandfather who his father wanted him to leave school, and they lived out west of Urana. And he shared the story with me that he wrote the letter into the, I think it was Sellers at the time, to say I was withdrawing my son at the end of the year. And Mr. Sellers drove all the way out in his little car to speak to the father to convince him to let him stay another year.
Yes.
And that was one of the stories that sort of showed the level of personal involvement.
Well, one of the initiatives that didn't really kick off was that they've started a farm, which was around about where there's a big factory. There was a big factory up in Glavington, and I think that was built on the land that the school had as the school farm. And I think Sellers' idea was to make this a rural boarding school, and because a lot of the boys were farmers' sons, and he could see that they wanted to go back onto the land, they didn't want to go to university, so he had two streams. So there was the rural stream and there was the academic stream. And the idea was that they would both be very strong. But unfortunately, things didn't work out that well. Financially, the school was always really scratching. And it did, actually, right up until why the schools merged was because the grammar school was on its knees financially. And they could see that Woodstock would bring in assets monetarily as well as extra students, because the numbers at that stage there was sort of like a strange anti-movement even among academics, particularly over in the United Kingdom. There was a lot of move over there to shut the prestigious boys' school like, I can't even think what their names now.
Eton, Winchester.
Well, the very well known. They thought the government should run them. They shouldn't be only for the rich. So there was a strong movement in England which washed over back into Australia. And there was also a lot of active antagonism towards private schools here in Australia. But the Headmasters Association dug their toes in, said we're not going. So fortunately, the private school movement survived, particularly in the boys' school. However, because of that antagonism or something, numbers dropped in private schools all around the state and in Victoria and New South Wales. So a lot of schools then had to merge to be viable. So you had the schools in Ballarat and Geelong, the well-known schools in Geelong. Girls came in with the boys to save both schools. The same thing happened here. So it was in the 1960s, actually, when numbers dropped and the schools had to look at other ways of surviving, basically, I think, from poor publicity.
And then you had the introduction of the Wyndham scheme in the early 70s, an extra year of school added, science needing to be taught. Yes. That really added a lot of financial pressure.
And of course, mathematics then became one of the major study areas. Also, I think the biggest challenge after that was when the government changed and we got a government that said girls should have more say. And then I think there was a lot of pressure put on schools to acknowledge the girls. That hadn't been a real problem here, but particularly I think because Alistair Todd really acknowledged the girls' worth within the school. My girls both played in the senior hockey team, which he coached. Like Alistair didn't see the difference between, and often girls were the senior schools but ducks, So there was a lot of opportunity. Girls had a lot of opportunity here at Scots. They never ever felt second-class citizens, which was all, and I think that's the same today, of course. But that's when I think the 60s really, under that particular government, a lot of that stress was put on schools to change the way they operated and how they perceived themselves, actually.
The history of the school is also interesting in the fact that at one time the school was Anglican, one time Presbyterian, now Uniting Church.
Yes.
So there's very few schools that have actually had that sort of religious diversity.
Right.
What impact do you think that's had on the school?
Well, I think because it was an Anglican base, the Bishop of Goulburn was all for education. And as soon as he hit Australia, he'd only just really been ordained. As soon as he hit Australia, I think he became the Bishop of Canberra, or wasn't Canberra then, Goulburn. He was the Bishop of Goulburn. So he found this man, this Anglican minister. How he found him, I don't know, but he could speak about 8 languages, and he set him out to start up Anglican schools throughout the bishopric. And one of those places was Albury. So that's how the Anglican school started here. We were one of Goulburn's chosen areas. So unfortunately, they got a gentleman as the headmaster who was very good and nursed it along. And then he died, unfortunately. So around about that time, the church here, the minister, I don't, not priest, is it? It's anyway, the minister in charge left and another one came in. And so the school sort of underwent a metamorphosis. But around about that time they lost their funding, and of course that's when Joseph Masters came on. But I think if it hadn't been for the Anglicans, the school wouldn't have survived. So when Joseph Masters came on, the school was non-denominational at that time. When it was sold to Wilson, Wilson was a Scot, and a Presbyterian Scot. So the school became Presbyterian. So all the time Wilson was here, it was a Presbyterian school. And then when Sallis came in, I think because of the things like the interest in the cadets and the pipe band and all that sort of thing, it continued on under the Presbyterian Church. And it was still under the Presbyterian Church until the schools till the denominations merged and became the one. The Wesleyans and the Presbyterians became one.
Fascinating.
Yes. But it was a very seamless, well, it wasn't very seamless change actually.
Can you tell us a little bit about that time, 1990? You know, the school amalgamated in 1972. The Uniting Church was formed in 1977 through the Presbyterians, Congregationalists, the Methodists and the Wesleyans. So
Yes.
you got a whole group there. What impact did that have on the school at the time?
Well, I don't think it did at all, because I think they were associated with St David's, and they stayed associated with St David's. It wasn't until the school, the Wesleyans and the Presbyterians merged, there was a lot of discussion about whether the school should stay under the educational administration of New South Wales, or whether, because the independent church headquarters in Victoria had a lot of influence then because of the merger of the two churches. So there was a lot of activity on the board to stay in New South Wales where they could remain Presbyterian, you see. So that wasn't okay as far as the independent church was concerned. So they did a lot of visits to the school, and in the end they just told the school, I'm sorry, but you're going to be an independent school. And that's what happened. It became under the Victorian Independent Synod.
And we're still part of the Victorian Tasmanian Synod.
Yes. So when Alistair came, of course, he was Presbyterian to his bootstraps. But the man he was, he became an elder down at St David's, and that's the association the school's always had.
You have written a remarkable book about the school. What has it meant to you personally, as a historian, as a community member, the different roles you've held in the school, to be the preserver of our history?
I think history, if we don't acknowledge history, the old saying is, if you don't acknowledge, you end up repeating the same mistakes. And I totally believe in that. I think history has a lot to teach us. So I think as far as the school was concerned, it needed to know about the warts as well as the good things. And there were some very, very difficult times, but I think when you go through difficult times, you're stronger, you learn lessons, hopefully, and you don't repeat them. So I think the current modern school needs to know how hard many people fought to keep it and enhance it and develop it and make it the school it is today. It just didn't sort of plop down out of the sky and become Scots. There was a lot of blood, sweat, anguish and tears in it being the school it is today. There are a lot of people who worked their very souls off to keep it going, at great detriment to their own health often. And I think the devotion of also a lot of older people who said, we're going to make this work, and stuck there, and the handing down from generation to generation in the boarding house, because one generation thought it was a good school and said this is where you should go. And I think a lot of that happens in families. But against the big schools in Melbourne, Scots has held its own still. So you must be doing something right.
So I'm leaning into that. From everything you've learned about the school, all of the different strong personalities, because there's a lot of strong personalities in the history of the school.
There still are.
Could you leave the community with a message? What do you think is the most important message for the current Scots community, based on everything that you've learnt through 160 years of history and research?
Don't forget your history. Be in touch with it. One of the things I'd suggest is that every child who enrolls in the school should have a booklet sent to them, just a small booklet that has a potted version of the school history, so that when they come into the school, they know what the houses are and what they stand for. They know what the colours are and why they're there. They need to know why the school has very old buildings and why the school has very modern new buildings. So it doesn't have to be that comprehensive, but they need to come into the school feeling as though they belong from the moment they step in the door for the first time. And I don't think that's ever been done. I've suggested it several times. It doesn't have to be a big initiative, but as long as I think from the very moment, and so this is also applicable to parents, so that when parents come in, they know about the school and why it's a good choice.
Excellent. Noelle, this has probably been one of the most pleasurable hours I've had in this school. As you know, I love history. I'm a history teacher. I could speak about history all day long, and I think what you've captured in our history book is quite remarkable, because when you look at it, it's quite a few disparate stories that you've actually been able to weave together. And it's not just about Scots, a lot of it's about the history of Albury. Yes. And around the district. And I think Scots has contributed for 160 years, not just to being a school, but being a centre of a really wide community that extends right across the Riverina and northeast Victoria. So we are indebted to you because you've done what nobody else was able to do. You put it in a format that is so readable, but it also contains personal stories. So on behalf of the community, thank you so much for capturing something that other people may have thought was too hard. And we are indebted to you, and generations afterwards, we've got that history that you've written from 1866 to 1991, and hopefully we're nearly ready for the next phase of the history book.
Well, I hope someone will pick up the banner and carry on. But I need to finish off by saying the pleasure has been all mine.
Thank you.